Whoa, it happened fast. A crack. A shove. Then silence. I hit the wall hard. My head snapped back, helmet clanging against cold stone. Rubble poured down like rain. Dust filled my throat. I couldn't see him anymore. Just his voice. Low. Calm. You belong with your rocks now. Then nothing. My flashlight flickered. One beam, cutting through the dust like a dying star. The entrance? Gone. Sealed shut like a tomb. I clawed at the rock, called his name. Mark. No answer. My hand shook. Blood on my knuckles. The smell of iron and limestone. This wasn't an accident. The rope he packed. The extra gear. The way he watched me when I found the lithium. It wasn't love. It was calculation. I backed into the corner, knees to my chest, trying not to sob. 18 years. Hikes. Anniversaries. Lauder over burnt pancakes. Gone. All because I was smarter than he wanted me to be. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a ticket out of debt. My discovery was worth millions. I thought we found it together. He planned to steal it alone. The silence pressed in, like the cave was breathing, waiting. I reached for my pack, flashlight half dead, protein bar, no signal, no hope. Then, a sound, scrape, shuffle, not rock, not wind, someone breathing. Another voice, in the dark. Don't move, she said. I know the way out. If you trust me. I froze, then whispered. Who are you? Her answer came slow. Someone who was left behind too. I didn't cry. Not yet. But my chest cracked open. Not from the fall, but from what he did. And what I might have to do next. Would you forgive a man who left you to die in the dark? Or would you fight back, quietly? 3 days before the cave, I stood in the kitchen, stirring cold coffee with a spoon that had seen better years. Mark was folding maps at the table. His fingers were too careful, too precise. Like a man setting a trap, not planning a trek. You sure about this weekend? I asked. He didn't look up. Just kept folding. Fresh air, no phones. You and me, like old times. Like old times. When his voice still made my stomach flutter. When he'd kissed the back of my neck while I cataloged minerals. Before the silence started taking up space between us. Before success became something I had to apologize for. I turned back to the sink. The window showed snow melting off pine branches. Early spring in Colorado. Mud thaw and the kind of air that felt honest. I'll need to bring extra core tubes, I said. There's still data I never logged from the Harper Ridge. He finally looked at me. That's not the point, Em. His voice wasn't angry. Just flat. You need to step back from work. Just this once. I nodded, though something in me curled. Noted. He used to brag about my career, the conferences, the write-ups in mining journals. Now he flinched every time I opened my laptop. In the garage that night, I saw the rope first, coiled neatly beside a new climbing axe. Too much gear for a 2-day survey. Planning on falling in. I joked. Mark grinned. You know me. Always ready. But he never used to overpack. He hated weight. I stared at the trunk. A water purifier. Flare gun. 3 days of food. I almost said something. But his arms wrapped around me from behind. Trust me? He said. Whispered it into my hair. Let's just breathe for a bit. And I wanted to. God, I wanted to. The truth is, I missed him. Even when he was standing right next to me. I missed us, so I let it go. Let the knot in my chest slide deeper. Told myself I was overthinking. He was trying. He was stressed. He was scared. He needed this. So did I. We left before sunrise. Mark drove. I watched the peaks roll past in silence. He put on our old playlist. The one with Tracy Chapman and Springsteen. He sang under his breath. Like nothing had ever gone wrong. Like we hadn't stopped touching each other months ago. The gravel road ended, in a trailhead no one else knew. He said he'd found it on a Reddit forum. I laughed. He didn't. The first day was hard. Snow in patches, slippery rock underfoot. But my boots held, and Mark was calm, focused. He knew exactly where to go. Every turn, every outcrop. He was ahead of me half the time. "You sure you've never been here?" I asked. He just winked. I read the topo maps. We reached a ledge by sunset. It overlooked a frozen stream that cut through the ridge like glass. He set up camp. Lit a fire. Opened a can of stew like we were still 25. It almost felt real again. We talked about college. About our old tent. How it leaked in Moab and we didn't care. He reached for my hand across the flame. I let him. Maybe he was right. Maybe this was what we needed. A break. A reset. Away from the world. He kissed me that night. Soft. Slow. But I still felt the knot. Still tasted the distance in his mouth. I lay awake long after he slept, staring at the stars through nylon. Wondering what it was I couldn't name. The next morning, we packed light. Mark said we'd only be down in the cave a few hours. Just enough to scout, he said. "I want you to see something. You'll love it." He sounded so sure, like a kid planning a surprise. He carried the heavy gear, flashlights, water. I held the maps. It was tight at first. The cave mouth barely shoulder wide. We had to slide sideways down a chute of crumbling stone. But once we got through, it opened into a chamber the size of a cathedral. I gasped. It was beautiful. Veins of mineral glittered on every surface. Lithium, if my eyes were right. High grade. It took my breath away. "This is incredible," I said. I turned to Mark. But he wasn't looking at the walls. He was looking at me. Just me. I smiled. "I need to sample this. You know what this could mean." He nodded slowly. Then walked to the edge of the chamber, where the ceiling narrowed to a funnel of loose shale. "I'll check the far side," he said. That knot in my chest. It pulled tight. I called after him. "Don't go alone. It's unstable." But he was already walking. Too casual. Too confident. I turned back to the vein, knelt with my hammer. Heart beating louder than it should have been. My flashlight caught something near my feet. An old climbing mark. Fresh. It wasn't our first time here. Not his, at least. I stood. Looked around, and for 1 second, I felt it. The air changed. Still. Heavy. Like the cave knew something I didn't. Then I heard it. The crunch of boots, a grunt, a slide of gravel, and the world came down. Would you ignore the signs, or trust your gut? Dust. In my mouth, my eyes, my lungs. I coughed hard, spitting grit into my palm. My helmet was gone. My flashlight half cracked. One knee throbbed like it had split open. I tried to sit. Something popped in my shoulder. But worse than the pain was the silence. No footsteps. No voice calling my name. Just stone. And absence. "Mark." My voice cracked. Nothing came back. Not even an echo. I leaned on one hand, shifted weight, forced myself to breathe. The air was thick, not choking, but stale. Heavy. I blinked. Flicked the flashlight. It buzzed to life. Flickered. Held. The chamber had changed. What was once a passage, gone. Rocks piled shoulder high. A full collapse. That chute. Sealed. No mistake. I crawled closer. Ran my hand across the stone. Fresh break. Loose shale. Someone had done this. I knew this formation. I knew this cave. This wasn't chance. He brought me here to bury me. I sat hard on the cold floor. Tried to think. To feel. But only one word stuck. Why? 18 years. We met on a hike. First kiss under a thunderstorm. Engagement with a map folded into the ring box. We used to plan our future in topo lines. Now he used them to plan my end. I laughed. Short. Ugly. That sound. Not mine. I looked down. His glove. Lying by the rocks. One of his. Torn at the cuff. Mud on the palm. Dropped on purpose. Or just careless. He left it like a signature. I picked it up slowly. Turned it over in my hand. the lining still warm. Mark. He used to trace my collarbone in the morning, brush dirt from my hair after a dig. And last night, he'd kissed me like he meant it. Had he already decided? Had he smiled? Knowing what he'd do. I curled over, arms tight around my knees. This wasn't some bad dream. It wasn't a test. He'd chosen this. Chosen to leave me under rock in silence, because I found something worth more than his pride. Because I succeeded without him. A memory flashed. 6 months ago. That award dinner. The way he held my elbow too tight. How he didn't clap when they called my name. The flat smile he wore when I thanked him in my speech. I'd excused it. Told myself he was tired. He wasn't tired. He was counting. Counting ways to erase me without guilt. The flashlight flickered again. I slapped the side. Held it steady. I had to move. Staying here meant dying, bleeding out, running out of air. The back chamber. There had been another fork. A narrow slit in the wall. I could barely fit. But I had to try. I packed what little I had, water bottle, tiny notepad, rock hammer, Mark's glove. I kept it not for him, but for me. I needed to remember how deep a betrayal can cut. The crawl space was tight. I scraped my elbow, twisted sideways. My breath echoed in my own ears. Heartbeat loud, steady. I whispered to stay sane. You've mapped darker caves. You've survived worse terrain. Just move. Every foot gained felt like 10. I dragged forward, praying I wasn't crawling into a grave. At one point my boot stuck. I panicked. Kicked too fast. Rocks shifted. One fell near my head. Close. Too close. Then a sound. Footsteps. No. A shuffle. But not mine. Someone else. I froze. Breath shallow. Light off. I pressed my back to the rock. Waited. Another sound. Closer now. And a light. Dull orange. Not LED. A flame. I raised my flashlight again. Clicked it once. Held my breath. The beam cut through the dark. Law and landed on a face. Not Mark. Not a stranger either. Not entirely. She looked like the mountain. Worn. Scarred. Still standing. Maybe 50. Gray streaked in her hair. One eye swollen slightly shut. A jagged cut across her cheek. Old and healed. She wore patchwork gear. Not fresh, but strong. In her hand, a lantern. Don't scream, she said. Calm. Like she'd done this before. I'm not here to hurt you. I didn't scream. Couldn't. My voice stayed buried in my chest. I just stared. Swallowed. Then whispered. Who are you? Please. She stepped closer. Lit the space with her lantern. I'm Clara. Her voice had gravel in it. And something steadier beneath. She looked past me. At the tunnel I'd just come through. You came through the lower fault. I nodded, still frozen. Clara sighed. Tired. Like someone who's seen too many people make the same mistake. You're not the first, she said, her eyes locked onto mine. You won't be the last. I felt my legs shake. This woman, she'd been here. Lived through something, maybe worse. Maybe the same. A pulse of warmth hit my chest. Hope, maybe. Or just the first thread of connection. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, the lantern flickered. Clara turned, motioned with her chin. Let's go. Before the tunnel closes too. Would you believe a stranger? Or go it alone? The cold hit harder when you moved. We followed a crack in the earth. We barely wide enough to breathe. Clara moved ahead, lantern steady, feet sure. She didn't talk much, just glanced back every few yards to make sure I was still coming. The tunnel narrowed again. Water ran along the bottom. Ankle. Deep. Freezing. I stepped in. Gasped. It felt like knives. You'll get used to it, Clara said. But her tone said, you never really do. My boots filled fast. Every step louder than it should be. Splash. Slosh. Grit. I slipped once. Caught myself on the wall. Sharp rock cut through my sleeve. Didn't bleed much. Didn't matter. We walked in silence for what felt like an hour. Finally, Clara stopped. Set the lantern on a ledge. She leaned against the wall, rubbed her knees, and looked at me like she already knew. "You're wondering," she said, "why I'm still down here." I didn't answer. But she nodded anyway, like my silence told her enough. "My brother," she said, "owned part of the land near this ridge. After our parents passed." She stared at the flame. "He said I was always the difficult one. Always too smart for my own good." Her mouth twisted. Not quite a smile. "He brought me up here for a snow survey. Said the weather would hold." I swallowed hard, already knowing where it was going, but it didn't. I whispered, "Nope." She flexed her fingers. "Blizzard hit fast. He pretended to go for help, said he'd be right back. Hey," she looked at me. "I waited in a cave for 2 days. No fire. No food. Just a bottle of whiskey he left me, said it'd take the edge off." I flinched. She raised one brow. "Sound familiar?" "Sound too familiar." I sat down slowly. Back to the rock, hands in my lap, trembling. I pulled out the glove. Marks. Still damp. Still real. "I signed over power of attorney last year," I said. Quiet. Clara didn't blink. Didn't judge. "He said it was for the grant paperwork." I added. "He was between jobs. Said we needed to look stable." I stared at the glove. At what I gave him. He needed me quiet. Agreeable. Not difficult. The anger started small. A spark in my chest. "I built everything," I whispered. She nodded. "That's why he hated it." Silence again. Only the sound of water and our own breath. Then Clara stood. Picked up the lantern, eyes more alert now. "We're close," she said. I followed her. The tunnel split after a few turns. 2 paths. Left, wide and dry. Right, narrow and steep. Both dark. Clara pointed to the left. "That one leads up. Out eventually. Takes hours. Rough terrain." Then she pointed right. "That one leads near the lower mouth. The one your husband probably used. But it's unstable." I stared at both. Clara waited. Didn't push. Didn't choose. My voice cracked. "Why give me options?" She tilted her head. "Because your choice matters. Not his." That hit harder than the cold. I looked down. At the cuts on my hands. The bruises on my knees. At the dirt under my nails. Proof I was still here. Still moving. And suddenly, I wasn't cold anymore. I was burning. Not loud. Not wild. But quiet. Steady. The kind of fire you don't see until it lights a fuse. "If I survive this," I said, "won't get away with it." Clara nodded once. Like she'd heard that before. And knew how it ended. I tightened my pack. Slipped the glove into the side pocket. And chose the path that led up, not just out, from but forward. Would you keep climbing? Or go back for justice? We came out just before dawn. The light didn't blind. It softened. Gray-blue. Like the world forgot to color itself yet. I staggered first. Hands on knees. Chest burning. Clara stepped behind me, one hand steadying my back. The trees looked different. Wider. Louder. The sky open, wind sharp, air clean. I blinked. Tears or sweat? I couldn't tell. We were alive. I tilted my head up and breathed. It felt earned. We hiked the final stretch in silence. Clara's compass took us north, toward the road, toward people. Every step felt like dragging a new body, heavier, changed. By noon, we reached the edge of a gas station town. 1 diner, 1 pump, 2 parked pickups. I looked down at myself, mud caked to my calves, sleeves torn, face streaked with soot. We stepped inside. A bell above the door jingled like nothing had happened. The heat made me dizzy. Grays. Coffee. Syrup. The world moved on while I was buried. A waitress turned. Then froze. "You okay, hon?" I opened my mouth. No words. Just a nod. She brought water. hot towels. Didn't ask more. She saw the look in Clara's eyes, dawn, and knew not now. I drank. Sipped again. Hands still shaking. Then I heard it. TV in the corner, muted. But running captions, and his face, Mark. I froze. Glass halfway to my lips. He was sitting in front of our house. Wrapped in a gray jacket. Hair messy. Eyes red. He looked perfect. The headline read, S. Husband speaks out after wife presumed dead in backcountry collapse. I felt Clara shift beside me. She saw it too. The waitress picked up the remote. Clicked the sound on. She was always braver than I was, Mark said. His voice cracked. Just enough. Too perfect. I told her not to go deeper, but she insisted. Always so passionate about her work. My stomach turned. Not from the food, from the script. She was the love of my life, he said, eyes glassy. If she hears this, Emily, please forgive me. I did everything I could. Clara muttered under her breath. I've heard better acting in middle school. I didn't speak. Just stared. I saw the jacket he wore. Mine. The one I left in the truck. He was draped in my things while selling his lie. He leaned forward on screen. She always chased rocks more than rest. I just wanted her home. I stood. Too fast. My knees wobbled. Clara caught my elbow. Easy, she said. Breathe. I looked at her. Her face steady. And in that moment I knew. He thought I was buried. Erased. Out of the way. But I was standing. Breathing. Holding every bruise like proof. I sat back down. Clara reached into her jacket. Pulled out something small. Plastic. Square. A trail camera. My brows pulled together. She shrugged. I set it up near the lower path. Tracks animals. Mountain lions mostly. Her eyes narrowed. It faces that chute. It runs 24/7. Motion triggered. I stared. My pulse slammed against my ribs. Still active. She nodded. I retrieved it the day before you came through. Didn't clear it yet. She slid it across the table. He's on it. The air left my lungs like a fist had hit me. She pushed a napkin over. Memory card still inside. I've got a reader. A silence wrapped the booth. But inside me, a shift. The fear didn't leave. It just moved. Became something else. Direction. I picked up the camera. It felt warm in my hand, even though I knew it wasn't. He buried me. And the cave closed. But I wasn't done. I brought the rocks with me. We didn't go home. Not yet. I wasn't ready to walk through a door that still held his scent. The same door he used before sealing me away. Instead, we found a small motel off the highway. Clara said the owner owed her a favor. I didn't ask. I couldn't think that far. The room was old. Curtains that didn't close right, carpet that smelled like time. But it had a lock, and right now, that was everything. Clara stayed up. Sat on the edge of the bed with her lantern beside her, transferring the footage from the trail cam. She moved like someone who had done this before. I sat at the table, still in my muddy pants, still wearing the flannel she'd handed me hours ago. I hadn't spoken since we left the diner. I held the memory card in my hand for what felt like hours. It felt too light for something that heavy. At 3:12 a.m., Clara slid the laptop across the table. Her voice soft but firm. Want to see it? I didn't. But I nodded anyway. She played the video. I leaned in. No sound. Just movement. Mark. There he was, standing exactly where I last saw him. He looked calm. Ordinary. Then he crouched. Lifted a rock. Pushed it over. Then another. And another. Each movement slow. Methodical. Intentional. There was no panic in him. No rush. No fear of collapse. Just calculation. When the rocks fell, he didn't even flinch. Just turned away and walked out of frame. I didn't blink once. When the screen went dark, Clara said, "That's attempted murder." I still said nothing. Because if I opened my mouth, I wasn't sure what would come out.
A scream, a sob, a name.
So I just breathed. In. Out. Once, then again. I felt hollow, like my body had survived, but something inside me hadn't. We made 5 copies. 1 stayed on Clara's drive. 2 went into separate envelopes. 1 on a flash drive, 1 on a backup card. 1 stayed with me, tucked inside my bra, closer to my heart than he ever deserved. At sunrise, I opened my email. Yas is to as Naomi Keller-esque. Subject as URG evidence attached. A Naomi was someone I met once. 3 years ago, at a Women in STEM conference in Denver. She spoke softly, but every word carried weight. She'd once said, "Justice whispers before it roars." I typed "We met in Denver. You may not remember me. I need help. This footage is real. He left me for dead." I sent the file. Then waited. She replied in 20 minutes. Asked I remember you. Send everything. Stay where you are. I'm on my way. Clara poured coffee. I didn't drink it. My hands wouldn't hold steady. By noon, the world believed I was gone. Colorado scientist feared dead after cave-in. Community mourns brilliant geologist. Loving husband speaks of loss. I sat on the bed, watching his face on the motel TV. My flannel wrapped around me like armor. Mark's voice cracked just right. His shirt was rumpled, the exact amount of grief. She was so full of life, he said. But the wilderness it takes without asking. I didn't throw the remote. Didn't yell. I just stared. And whispered, "You didn't bury me. You revealed me." He called me brilliant. Now, after trying to erase me, I opened the manila folder I always carried for fieldwork. Inside were years of documents. Travel grants, shared titles, power of attorney papers I signed. Temporarily. God. How many times had I handed him control because I thought I was protecting him, helping us? Just for the account, he'd said. Just for taxes. I went page by page. Highlighted names. Marked the wires. Noted what he moved when and who got notified. Clara came back from the gas station with 2 cups of tea and a pack of crackers. She didn't say much. Just slid the tea toward me and left me alone. By the time Naomi arrived, I had notes in 3 columns. She didn't knock. Just stepped in, tossed her coat on the chair and sat, her voice low, her face unreadable. "Let me see it." We played the video. Again, Naomi leaned forward. Didn't blink, didn't interrupt. When it ended, she exhaled once, then looked at me. "Do you want justice?" I opened my mouth, but my voice cracked. Not from fear, from grief. Not for Mark, but for the girl I'd been when I believed him. "I want truth," I said. "Even if no one claps for it." She nodded. And got to work. She took my photos. The wrist still scraped raw, the bruises on my forearm, my boot split open. She documented everything. Every email, every transaction, every absence in his story that my survival filled. That night I couldn't sleep. The motel light hummed. Clara snored softly. I sat alone, staring at Mark's glove. The one I'd carried since the collapse. I turned it over, laid it flat, took a pen and wrote across the palms of suppers I made it out. Doxexa just that. In the morning, Naomi stood at the window, her coffee cooling. "There's a hearing next week." I blinked. She added, "Protective order, emergency injunction, and asset freeze." I sat up, still groggy. "So soon?" She turned. "He doesn't know you're alive. We use that." Then she paused. "You don't have to testify, but it would help." I looked down at my hands. So dry, so cracked, still dirty. Then I looked at the mirror. At the lines around my mouth that weren't there a week ago. At the eyes that didn't blink anymore. And I thought of Mark. Of his breath hot on my neck as he whispered, "You belong with your rocks now." He thought that was the last thing I'd hear, the final chapter. but I'd rewritten the ending in dirt and grit and bruised survival. I met Naomi's gaze. Will he be there? She nodded once. My throat was dry, but my voice didn't tremble. Then I'll be there too. If the world believed you were dead, would you rise quietly or loudly? The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. The motel ceiling cracked in one corner. The fan squeaked every third spin. I lay there, eyes wide, counting the number of breaths it took to stop shaking. Clara sat by the window, her boots still on, watching the parking lot like it was a battlefield. I'd asked her once why she stayed. She just said, because no one believed me, once. That was enough. At 2 a.m. I opened my laptop, drafted the email. To U.S. Geological Survey as subject, urgent field discovery documentation. I attached the footage. My field notes. Time, stamped data from the GPS unit he didn't know I kept in my side pouch. I explained what I found. How deep it ran. The markers I left. The samples still in my car. Then I hit send. 5 minutes later, I sent a second email. As to is Western Research Institute's subject, 2023 grant denial. I'd applied last year. They chose someone else. Someone with fewer publications, but a firmer handshake. This time, I attached the truth. Don't name the discovery after me. I wrote, just make sure my work gets buried deeper than my body almost did. Then I shut the screen and waited for morning. Naomi drove. Clara sat in the back with a file box on her lap and a pocket knife in her boot. She never said, but I knew. Just in case. I wore black slacks, a blazer I hadn't worn since a conference in Austin, and the smallest necklace my mother ever gave me. A simple stone. Clear. Honest. We arrived 15 minutes early. The courthouse was beige and unremarkable. 2 stories, flag out front. Steps worn by arguments and regrets. Inside, the clerk nodded politely. Naomi did the talking. I stood still, hands clasped. My skin didn't itch. My knees didn't shake. I'd already survived the worst silence a human can know. The silence of being buried alive. This was just air. Mark was already seated when we entered. He turned. Saw me. His face went completely still, like his brain couldn't compute what his eyes just reported. Then came the shift. Jaw tight. Eyes glassy. And then, the performance. He stood. Took a step. Emily. Naomi cut in. She won't be speaking to you directly. He looked at me like I had betrayed him. That almost made me laugh. He sat down slowly, palms flat on the table, trying to reclaim control. The judge entered. A woman, late 50s. Sharp eyes, no nonsense. I liked her immediately. She read the motion. Asked for statements. Mark's lawyer spoke first. Regret. Confusion. Tragic miscommunication. He was devastated. He believed his wife was lost. There was no intent. Only panic. They handed in photos. His interviews. The bouquet on the doorstep. I felt nothing. Then it was our turn. Naomi stood. Explained our filing. Outlined the timeline. Presented the video. The room watched in silence. Again, his face. His boots. The rocks. The deliberate pause. Then the walk away. The judge's brow tightened. Naomi stepped aside. Looked at me. Gave a small nod. I rose. My heels didn't wobble. My voice didn't crack. I trusted him. I said. For 18 years. The court reporter's fingers began to click. I stood beside him when we had nothing. I gave him access to every part of my life. My name. My research. My earnings. My silence. A breath. But silence can kill. It nearly did. I looked at Mark. He looked at the floor. I walked out of that cave with every bruise earned by love misplaced. I held up the glove. The one I carried from the beginning. This is the only part of him I brought back. The room didn't move. I placed the glove on the table. Folded once. Quiet. I am not seeking revenge. I am reclaiming truth. The judge said nothing for a long while. Then finally, "Thank you, Ms. Carter." I sat down. Clara reached forward and squeezed my shoulder. When we left the room, a woman in a gray coat near the back touched her heart. Then whispered, "She walked out of the mountain." I didn't turn around, but I heard it, and I carried it with me. If you had the chance to speak your truth while he watched, would you whisper, or make the whole room fall silent? The hearing ended at 10:42 a.m. By noon, the media started circling. A few local outlets ran headlines. Oz missing scientist reappears. Husband under investigation. Thus, trail camera footage raises questions in cave incident. Miss Naomi said the words no one wanted to say, but everyone needed to hear. This is attempted murder, and we have video. The process wasn't fast. Justice never is, but something shifted. Not loud, not flashy, but undeniable. 3 days after the hearing, the judge signed off on a formal investigation. Mark's assets were frozen. The house, our house, locked under court order. I didn't want it. Not anymore. But knowing he couldn't sleep there was enough. The Geological Survey responded next. They confirmed the GPS logs, the date stamps, the mineral samples. A week later, they issued a public statement as TAS. The preliminary discovery and site analysis belonged to Dr. Emily Carter. No shared credit. No Mr. and Mrs. Taglines. Just me. I read it twice alone in the motel room before forwarding it to Naomi. Then deleted the email. I didn't print it. Didn't frame it. I didn't need to. Mark stopped appearing on television. His lawyer pulled back interviews. No comment. Became his only script. Someone asked Naomi if we wanted to hold a press conference. She looked at me. I shook my head. If truth is loud enough, it doesn't need a microphone. She smiled. Didn't push us, sir, as I moved into a one-bedroom above a coffee shop on the edge of Boulder. The landlord didn't ask questions. The view showed the edge of the ridge, the one that almost kept me. Clara helped carry boxes. She didn't have many of her own. She stayed in town, not permanently, but long enough to see this through. Some nights, we sat on the fire escape with mugs of black tea. We didn't say much. She'd watch the stars. I'd listen to the quiet. One night, she asked, "Do you ever think you should have fought harder to expose him publicly?" I shook my head. He exposed himself. I just survived long enough for the story to catch up. She raised her cup. To survival. The US 3 weeks later. I got an email from the Colorado Mineral Association. Mess. You've been selected to present your findings at the annual regional summit. No strings. No double names. Just me. I stared at the screen for a full minute before replying. I accept. The conference wasn't big. A few hundred attendees. Geologists, surveyors, students. I wore the same blazer. The one from the hearing, the one that still smelled like motel soap, no matter how many times I washed it. Clara came with me. Sat in the front row. Silent. Steady. When my name was called, I walked on stage. My slides loaded. My boots didn't shake. Slide 1, topography of the ridge. Coordinates. Drill depth. Slide 2, lithium deposits. Field notes. Sample analysis. Slide 3, a single line Ellendra's discovery credited to Dr. Emily Carter. No initials. No shared citations. Just me. A few people clapped early. A little too soon. Then others joined. I raised my hand. Quieted the room. And I spoke. Measured? Clear. I stand here today not because I'm a hero. Not because I was brave. But because I was buried and decided I didn't belong underground. A murmur in the crowd. No questions yet. Just listening. I found something valuable. But I almost lost more than that. I paused. Myself. No slideshow. No press release. Just my voice. Let the record show the work stands. even if people tried to disappear the woman behind it. Silence. Then, applause. Not wild, not forced. Earned. I stepped off the stage. Clara stood, didn't say anything, just met me at the bottom, and handed me a small folded note. It read, This time you get to choose what stays buried. Aske, I folded it again. Tucked it in my jacket. Didn't cry. Not then. Not there. Isosexus. That night, I sat by the window. The street below buzzed with people, living lives untouched by caves and cameras. I drank coffee from the same chipped mug I found in the motel. The one Clara refused to throw out. And I looked at the rocks lined up on my sill. Samples from the ridge. Each one a sentence from the story no one got to rewrite. My name was still being whispered in quiet corners. But I didn't need a crowd. Didn't need headlines. I had legacy. Not because I demanded it, but because I lived long enough to claim it myself. If justice came not with fury, but quiet clarity, would you still call it justice? Spring came late to Boulder that year. The snow melted slower. The wind stayed longer. But when the first alpine tulip pushed through the gravel near my stairwell, I smiled. It wasn't just a flower. It was proof that things grow again. Even when buried all winter. Even when the ground forgets what warmth feels like. Clara had left 2 weeks earlier. No warning. Just a note on my kettle. Time for the next ridge. You know the way now. That was Clara. Never one for goodbyes. She believed in clean breaks. Buy and survival. I kept the note taped to the inside of my cabinet. Right beside a chipped mug she refused to throw away. The same one I drank from after the hearing. The one I held when I opened the email that confirmed the lithium rights were mine. I used to think justice had a sound. Something loud. Final. Turns out, it sounds like silence. Like peace returning slowly. Like breath. The glove stayed too. I mounted it in a small shadow box, just above my desk. Still folded, still marked. Not as a trophy, not revenge, just a reminder that I listened to the wrong voice for too long. But eventually listened to my own. I started teaching again. Not in lecture halls, not behind podiums. Workshops, field seminars, community classes where women brought their boots and backpacks and learned to read the earth. I taught them how to trust data, but more than that, how to trust themselves. At one seminar, a girl, maybe 19, raised her hand. She said, "Is it true you survived a cave-in? Like, really walked out alone?" I didn't answer at first. I just looked at the other women in the room, some old, some young, some already marked by betrayal. And I said, not alone, never alone. But yes, I walked out. After that class, someone left a package at my doorstep. No return address. Inside, a quartz crystal, wrapped in wax paper that smelled faintly of pine smoke. Underneath, a note. Still collecting. I pinned it to my calendar board. Legacy doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives in the quiet. In the women who show up to learn. In the voices who say, "I believe you. I needed this. I didn't think I could." I didn't write much at first. But one night, after the summit, I reopened my old field blog. The one I stopped updating back when I was still trying to make room for someone else's name. I titled the new entry, Luff. Below the surface, notes from someone who didn't stay buried. I didn't share it. Didn't post a link. But by morning, it had 78 comments, some anonymous. Some signed Linda, 57, Georgia. WM, Oregon. I cried reading this. You wrote my story. I read them all. Aloud. To no one. To myself. Some I saved. Printed. Kept in a folder I labeled, Proof of Life. Not legal proof. Emotional. The kind you cling to when you forget why you crawled out in the first place. One woman wrote, he said, "I'd never make it without him. But I'm here. You reminded me that I get to define what made it means. Another. My daughter asked me what survival looks like. I showed her your blog. I cried that night. Not for him. Not for me. But for the knowing that this story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who's ever heard. You're too much. You're imagining things. You're overreacting. And walked out anyway. I went back to the ridge once, not to relive it, but to stand still. The trail was colder than I remembered. Shorter somehow. I didn't go down. I didn't need to. I walked to the overlook. Pulled up my GPS, marked the coordinates. Not for a report. For me. Then I whispered, just once. I came back. On my terms. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment. Lights off. Only the sound of wind tapping against the glass. I held a rock in each hand. one from the original ridge, one gifted by a stranger. And I wrote the last line of the entry. I wasn't buried. I was becoming. Asin not broken. Becoming. And that's what I tell them now. The students. The strangers. The ones who write in quiet hope. You don't owe anyone survival that looks clean. You only owe yourself the truth. And a way out that leaves your name intact. Healing didn't happen all at once. It didn't arrive with court orders, or legal wins daily, or media silence. It came in fragments. It came in the way I learned to breathe again. Without waiting for someone else's approval. It came when I stopped flinching at the sound of boots on gravel. It came when I let myself say his name, without fear it would undo me. Sometimes, I still wake thinking I'm under rock. Thinking there's no light ahead. But then I remember. I found my way back, with hands bloodied, but heart intact, and that matters more than the pain ever could. I've spoken at 4 conferences since. Each time, I wear the same jacket. Each time, someone finds me afterward. In a hallway, by the coffee, outside a restroom. And they say the same thing. I didn't think I could tell my story. Until I heard yours. That's legacy too. It isn't just about property, or minerals, or paperwork. It's about the sound of your own voice, coming back to you, after being buried in someone else's silence. Now, every month, I host a small circle, 5 women, sometimes 7. We sit in the library's back room, with maps and tea, and silence that slowly becomes speech. Some of them cry. Some of them don't. All of them carry something someone else tried to bury. We talk about rediscovery. Not just of land, but of ourselves. I don't tell them what to do. I just listen. Because sometimes the most radical thing we can offer is witness. One woman brought her daughter last week. She couldn't have been older than 15. She looked at me and asked, "How do you know when you've made it through?" I smiled. "You'll stop trying to disappear. That's how you'll know." She nodded, didn't speak. But I saw it. The moment something clicked. That's what this has become now. Not a story about a cave, or a betrayal, or even revenge. It's a map, left behind, for whoever needs to find their own way out. And maybe, just maybe, they'll add their own trail markers beside mine. And that's how we keep each other going. One truth at a time. If you've ever come back from something they thought would end you, tell us. What did you become? Your story matters. Share it below. You are not alone.